this paper is about the so-called implementation challenge for conceptual engineering. And what I want to do is to first try and propose a formulation of the challenge that is as neutral as possible. I'll explain what I mean by neutral. And then reflect on the notion of control and try to address it, not so much solve the problem or sort of completely refute it, but put it into perspective and question it in a sense. Okay. All right, so the so-called implementation challenge is about projects in conceptual engineering. We all know that these are projects that purport to identify defective concepts and to revise them or replace them with the aim of improving our representational repertoire. And there are many phases that have been identified in this process. And so after the whole process of assessment and of proposed re-engineering of a concept, the implementation phase should begin. This means that the conceptual changes should be adopted by more or less extended linguistic communities. So the extension of the communities is depends on case by case, but usually that's what implementation is understood to be. How to carry out such implementation, and most importantly, is such implementation even possible or reasonably feasible? So there have been objections to the implementation of conceptual engineering projects. So I think most influential so far articulation of this challenge is due to Herman Kaplan, and he articulates the challenge both from the point of view of an externalist metasemantics and from the point of view of an internalist metasemantics. And the idea here is, let's start with the formulation in terms of externalism. Let's see the internalist one, and let's try to draw some reflections on those. So the starting point, especially for Kaplan, is the assumption of semantic externalism, the idea that the intensions and extensions of linguistic expressions are partly determined via supervenience by the external environments, by things like experts in the community, the history of use going back to the introduction of the term, complex patterns of use over time, and what the world happens to be like. What's the problem here? The problem here is a problem of, primarily a problem of epistemic access to the supervenience base of whatever it is that determines the meanings of the terms, which are the targets of the sort of semantic change that conceptual engineers want to achieve. We do not have epistemic access to the supervenience base of the current meaning of relevant terms, or we don't have epistemic access to the relevant mechanisms for reference change that determine reference or meaning change. And this lack of epistemic access implies a metaphysical lack of control, which undermines the prospects for successful conceptual change. This happens under externalism, but things don't look any better for internalism. Internalism, as we all know, is the idea that the intensions and extensions of linguistic expressions are determined by supervenience, by features of individuals. And here again, we do have an epistemic and a metaphysical lack of control, because as Kaplan says, internalism is compatible with the meanings and extension of supervening on features of me that I have no control over. And it's also compatible with it being unsettled and unstable, what combination of internal figures grounds reference. So Kaplan concludes there's just no step from internalism to our having control over the extensions and intentions of our expressions. So this is a statement of the implementation challenge by Kaplan. one thing that sort of draws our attention is that the articulation of a challenge is based on two theories, internalism and externalism, that are supervenience-based theories. Supervenience-based metasemantic accounts are widely accepted by contemporary analytic philosophers. So it makes sense, especially if one is assuming that conceptual change goes through semantic change. It makes a lot of sense to, let's say, adopt or assume supervenience-based metasemantic accounts. Yet, the thought here is, even if supervenience-based accounts were false, the implementation challenge would still stand, at least intuitively, if we wanted to change concepts or something that has to do with concepts, the way we use them, the way we reason, the way we speak. There would still be problems with implementation, whether or not supervenience-based account of meaning are true or false. So the idea is that a supervenience-based formulation of the challenge is not, strictly speaking, needed. So what I'm going to do is try to outline some alternatives for supervenience-based accounts of meaning, and then try to achieve a neutral formulation. So the neutrality of the formulation has to do with whether or not we are assuming determination claims for meaning. So what are a couple of alternative accounts when it comes to meaning? Alternative accounts to supervenience-based accounts. Well, one alternative account is that there is no such thing as meaning. So supervenience theories of meaning might be false because there is such thing as meaning, except maybe as a façon de parler. And this view has some sort of consolidated tradition. Well, one position that we know from Wittgenstein, from Wine, from Kripke, is meaning skepticism, the idea that, well, in Wittgenstein's work, there is the idea that there is no meaning, there is only use. Kripke is a meaning skeptic because of considerations of the normativity of meaning. And Quine famously points out that there is no, let's say, neutral way of establishing whether an expression means or refers to something. So meaning is somehow, or reference is deeply relative. So this means that it's inscrutable unless we are already embedded in some sort of frame of reference. Anyway, meaning skepticism, meaning eliminativism, a view that has been not endorsed, but surely it has been articulated by Recanati, by Kaja-Shashut. So the idea being that meanings as abstract entities are, well, that they're not there. All that there is collections of uses. So what we do when we interpret speech is comparing the occurrence of a certain word in the present context with occurrences of the same word in previous contexts, and do the interpretation based on that comparison. So this is one alternative. Another alternative is that there is no supervenience. Meaning may be a brute fact, a fact that does not supervene on anything. And this is a view that is reflected in a recent proposal by Kens and Magidor called semantic sovereignty. So the idea is that meaning doesn't supervene on anything. It's a brute aspect of the world, even a fundamental aspect of the world. And well, we might have some sort of epistemic access to it by means of considerations about use or about elements in the environment, but these might be ways of accessing meaning, but these are not ways that meaning is determined. So because meaning is something that is in the world and is not determined by anything. So the idea here is, well, these are certainly, they're not the views of the majority, but they are available views, and they are views that might be true for all we know. And even if either of these two scenarios obtained, the implementation challenge would still hold. Why would it still hold? Well, I think it would still hold because the implementation as conceptual engineers conceive it, or try to articulate it, is primarily a practical problem. A problem that continues to exist no matter what factors determine or fail to determine meaning. And this problem is practical because it relates to the actions of single individuals, and how these actions affect the actions of other individuals and other aspects in the world. So the consequences of these actions, and the way in which these elements, actions affecting others individuals' actions and the world and all these consequences, can be controlled and manipulated at will. So these considerations, I think, prompt us to formulating the interpretation challenge in a neutral way that possibly captures its practical character. So is there room for a neutral implementation challenge? I would like to identify the challenge in terms of what I would want to call an uptake problem. So a few assumptions to start with. I will work under the assumption that an important, although perhaps not the only factor that we should in principle control in conceptual change, is language use, both other people's language use and our own. Now, I realize that maybe this is not the only thing that matters. Surely is a thing that matters a lot. If you read around the literature, it seems like, well, one of the main worries is, well, how do we get members of linguistic communities to switch to a different use of words? If anything, because this would be the observable correlate of a conceptual change. So a lot of importance is given to language use. Now, obviously, it may be that just changing language use would not be enough. So we're not looking for a purely behavioristic take on the implementation challenge. Surely other things should change for the desired change to be valuable. Changes in beliefs, changes in sort of causal sources of reference, for example, cognitive changes perhaps. And I think all of these factors can be seen as causally relevant background factors for language use, so that we're not simply focusing, sorry, we're not simply focusing on external behavior or other subjects, linguistic practices in the most superficial sense. So this would mean that one very important factor to be controlled or to be manipulated or to be affected is language use plus its causally relevant background factors, which include environmental elements, social and cognitive features. Environmental elements include what I've already mentioned, causal sources of reference. Social aspects include linguistic conventions, cultural aspects. cognitive features include, well, whatever cognitive features enable language learning or language relearning, and that ground our linguistic competence. So all of this seems to me the right background for giving a formulation of the implementation challenge that is independent of supervenience-based claims about meaning. So the challenge would take the shape of what I call the uptake problem. Assuming that implementing conceptual change involves changing linguistic usage and its relevant background factors, this process is hindered by the lack of control that anyone has over the way other people choose to use language. So how do we motivate this formulation of the challenge? And how do we show that it's relevant and that it's also, in a sense, more advantageous than the supervenience-based one? Well, first of all, the idea of uptake. Let's say that uptake is a person's use of language that follows someone's initial example or someone's initial recommendation. Uptake, being an instance of language use, is certainly a free choice, but it is also constrained in many ways by causal environmental factors, social, cultural factors, cognitive constraints. So these two elements, the element of free choice and the elements of the constraints on free choice, happen to be really just difficult in a metaphysical sense to control. So barring science fiction-like scenarios, generally, I think it's quite obvious that nobody can, in a metaphysical sense of the model, can control either speakers' free choices in language use. So there's always a chance that people don't follow your lead because it's a free choice, but also it's difficult to control whatever complex factors constrain this free choice. So our own culture and the way our culture affects the use of our beliefs, the use that we make of concepts and of language. So it's a mixture of free choice and lack of predictability, but also of constraints from prior history, we could say. So very simply, since changes in language use are important ingredient of conceptual change, lack of control over others' agents' language use, what I've called uptake, will constitute an important obstacle to the implementation of conceptual change. So there's the sort of motivation and justification for why focus on uptake, why focus on this rather than a supervenience-based claim. So as an aside, but this will become more important later, the idea of lack of control is central to the uptake problem and to the implementation challenge as a practical problem. The notion of control is not defined, not only in this formulation, but also in Kaplan's formulation. We can work, I think we can very well work with an intuitive understanding of control. There's a possible gloss that we could help ourselves with by Daniel Dennett, which says that A controls B if and only if the relation between A and B is such that A can drive B into whichever of B's normal range of states A wants B to be in. So control has to do with volition, with desires, and with causation. Causation that is linked to a subject or an agent's volition. I don't think it matters a lot whether we define control or whether we work with an intuitive understanding of control, because I think for the purposes of the implementation challenge, what matters is how do we, well, the degree of control. So if we are reading the formulation of the implementation challenge that I proposed the uptake problem. Well, what's the amount of control that we have in mind? And this also holds for other formulations of the implementation challenge. Well, suppose it's the amount of control that is relevant to the uptake problem is total or high control. So what we're saying is we don't have total or high control over language use and its causally relevant background factors. Then I think with this interpretation, there's no doubt that the uptake problem is true, or any other formulation of the implementation challenge, because it's almost trivial that we don't have total or high control. So under this interpretation of control, there's no doubt that there is this problem. But if we interpret control as significant degree of control? So what if the uptake problem just states that we don't have a significant degree of control of language use and its causally relevant factors? Then I think there is room here for at least questioning and at least developing further considerations that ultimately lead to questioning the problem. So if we interpret control as a significant degree of control, the uptake problem, I don't think it's obviously true. But I'll say more on this later on. This is just an aside, sort of preview of what will come next. At this moment, I'm more worried about giving sort of theoretical motivation for the uptake problem. And so what I want to say is that there are some theoretical advantages in conceiving the implementation challenge as an uptake problem. The main advantage is that it's neutral. So it cuts across various ways of conceiving of the metasemantics of language. It cuts across externalism, it cuts across internalism, it cuts across eliminativist accounts, and also the sort of no supervenience accounts. Why? Well, suppose any of these accounts is true. Suppose externalism is true. There are a number of things that we definitely cannot control, like what the causal sources of certain language uses are. If there's anything in principle that we should be able to control under the assumption of externalism, is language use, at least that, okay? But the uptake problem says, well, we don't control it. So if externalism is true, the uptake problem holds under the assumption of externalism. And I think the same reasoning can be given by assuming internalism, by assuming eliminativism, by assuming the no supervenience accounts. If internalism is true, for example, we can't control the states, the psychological states over based on which meaning supposedly supervenes. If there's anything we can in principle control in internalism is language use, at least language use. But again, if the uptake problem is true, then we have difficulties in that too. So the uptake problem holds even if internalism is true. If there is not such thing as meaning and there is only use, well, I think a fortiori it would hold in the sense that if there's anything that we should in principle control, if there is no such thing as meaning and there is only use, well, it's used. But then if the uptake problem is true, it questions this, and so on and so forth. So I think the uptake problem really cuts across different metasemantic options. Also, I think that the uptake problem comes with less metaphysical baggage that can engender epistemic problems. For example, the metaphysical baggage of supervenience. So it seems so much more mysterious to access this sort of relation between the supervenience base and meaning itself when we think of meaning as supervening on on use and other features. So much so that if we think of eliminating supervenience, taking it out of the picture, then maybe things look simpler and less epistemically mysterious and more accessible. Maybe there's only use, and all that we have to access, epistemically access, is use and its causally relevant factors. And maybe that's super messy, but there isn't that extra element of metaphysical mystery that makes it so hard and difficult to sort of grasp epistemically. So if the focus is only on language use and its causally relevant factors, maybe things are easier for us. I mean, they might be messy because causal chains and causal relations might be messy, but still, the metaphysics would be more manageable. Well, there's also less technical jargon or controversial notions, again, supervenience. And also, I think the uptake problem allows us to focus on core elements of the implementation challenge as a practical problem, namely language use, free choice, constraints on free choice, and control, and the idea of control. So I think these are some of the theoretical advantages that we would get if we went for the uptake problem. So very quickly, one objection or comment that has been made to me in previous presentations was, well, but what was wrong with supervenience? I mean, supervenience, it wasn't, the supervenience-based formulation wasn't that bad, because at least it was focusing on meaning, which seems to be a more suitable target for conceptual change. It seems more natural to think that if you want to change concepts, you might want to address and target meanings. So this seems more natural than just going for changing language use and its causally relevant factors. Now, I don't share this intuition, but some people have this intuition. So how to accommodate it, how to sort of try to strike a balance between the need for less metaphysical mystery and the need for meaning as a target. I think we can, in some sense, deflate even the supervenience-based formulation. We could say, for example, well, we don't know and cannot control the features that in our construal of things license saying that an expression E means M. So we sort of reformulate the supervenience-based implementation challenge by adding this sort of constructivist flavor, where it's not like meaning is determined, it's just that patterns of use license us to say that expressions blah, blah, blah mean blah, blah, blah. So maybe this is a way of making the objector happy. Maybe there's a way of adopting a deflated formulation of the implementation challenge. Alternatively, one could simply see the uptake problem as an additional challenge, just over and beyond the previous one, the supervenience-based one. This would mean that there is just one more problem for the conceptual engineer. But I'm happy to address this in the Q&A. I just wanted to flag that there has been this comment to the proposal. Okay, so far I've been busy trying to sort of sell you this neutral version of the implementation challenge. Now I would like to draw some considerations that go in the direction of addressing it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the idea of lack of control was central to the uptake problem. And I think it's, indeed, I think it's the key for addressing it. So let's reflect a little bit on this idea of lack of control. Let's do some, if you wish, ordinary language philosophy about it. So let's try to understand a little bit better how we use expressions like having control, being in control. First of all, I think it's quite clear that the notion of control, sorry, I'm being a bit sloppy. I'm not putting control in within commas, but it should be within commas. Anyway, the notion of control appears to be a gradable phenomenon. So it appears to talk about a gradable phenomenon. We say things like that some person has better control over certain facts or skills than another person, that we can gain control. So this all suggests a semantics of the word control, of the discourse about control, that has an element of gradability. Second, and I think that's the most important datum here, control and our speech, our discourse about control appears to be goal relative. And I want to stress that in my response to the implementation challenge. So just to illustrate this idea of the goal relativity of control, let's try out a couple of scenarios to see whether we do indeed understand control as goal relative. So suppose that I wish to write a full-length publishable paper in 3 days. Sorry, this is a very silly example. That's the first example that came to mind. So suppose I set this goal for myself: in 3 days, writing a publishable paper. And suppose that to achieve that, I have to stay focused for very many hours in a row. And my friend says, no, that's impossible. You cannot control your focus. And I think, strictly speaking, she says something false, because I do have some degree of control over my focus. I can do something to create an environment where I can stay focused for a while. So at least I have a modicum of control over my focus. But plausibly what she means is, well, you cannot control your focus to a sufficient degree given the goal that you have set yourself. So your goal requires a level of control that you cannot achieve. You have some control, but it's not enough. So that, I think, sort of begins to show that there is some relation between degrees of control and the goals that we set for ourselves. So let's try out another scenario, which this time involves myself and other people. So suppose I coordinate a team of 5 people who must each produce a full-length publishable paper in 3 days, and they all have to stay focused for many, many hours in a row. And my friend says, oh, that's impossible. You cannot control their focus, and they cannot control their own focus. Again, she's saying something false, I think, strictly speaking, because we all have a little bit of control over each other's focus. What she means is you cannot control their focus, and they cannot control their own focus to a sufficient degree given the goal you have set for yourself. Again, your goal is too ambitious. It requires a threshold, a control threshold that you cannot really meet. So you have some control, but not enough. So this leads to the idea, I think, that setting specific goals for ourselves may require also implicitly, perhaps, fixing a threshold for the degree of control that we should attain to achieve the goal itself. If the threshold is met, we have sufficient or significant control. If it is not met, we do not have significant or sufficient control. So the focus here is on the threshold, the control threshold. So how does this affect the lack of control judgment about the implementation of conceptual change? Simply put, I would say that different control thresholds will predictably generate different control-related assessments. So expecting total or high control over the way other people choose to use language would be setting too high a threshold. And this will presumably generate a negative control assessment. I'm not saying that anyone does this, but if anyone did expect total or high control, they would surely be disappointed. They would be setting the bar too high. So in a sense, it's quite obvious, if you wish, that the bar should not be set too high. So what if we set for a lower threshold of control for conceptual engineering? What happens then? Well, what happens? What would it mean to set a lower control threshold? Perhaps accepting the following things. First, accepting that our influence over the use of language made by other people is indirect and exposed to a certain risk of failure. And this in turn might imply accepting, acknowledging, realizing that, for example, fewer speakers than expected will change their use of language in accordance with our recommendation. Or speakers might acquire unstable dispositions to use language after being exposed to the recommendations of the conceptual engineer. So they might use that word in the right, let's say the right way in some contexts, and switch to a wrong use of the word in other contexts. So they might have unstable dispositions. Also, setting a lower control threshold might mean accepting that the pursued linguistic change might take longer than expected, that it might happen for a brief moment in time and then get undone by factors that we cannot control, or perhaps it might never even happen. So what does it all mean? It means, in a sense, lowering the control threshold, in a sense, becoming aware of the constraints, the obstacles to the goal that we've set for ourselves, while at the same time, in a sense, gaining control by admitting that we just have no control over those factors. We may have control over other factors, but not on those. And I don't think that's a negative upshot. I think for anyone who has written grant proposals, being aware of the possible contingencies, of the possible risks of failure, of things that might go just not your way, is a plus. It's a plus. It's certainly a plus. It makes your proposal more realistic, more feasible, especially if you devise countermeasures to address the possible contingencies. So this means setting a lower control threshold bar, and at the same time reappraising the whole enterprise by factoring in also the risk factors. So what's the conclusion here? So do we have or do we lack sufficient or significant control over other people's language use? So I'm focusing still on the idea of affecting language use. My response is it depends, because what we've seen is that control is goal relative. And so perhaps if the goal is carefully spelled out, taking into account the relevant time, space, and audience-related constraints, the possible obstacles and contingencies, as well as appropriate and realistic expectation, it may be the control threshold related to the goal thus specified permits a sufficient and therefore significant level of control over the way in which speakers choose to deploy language. And by the same reasoning, it could be that someone who says, no, we don't have control, maybe they are not conceiving the goal, the expected goal, in a way that is comprehensive enough and that factors in these elements of possible failure. So this gives us, I think, a flexibility in assessing in the implementation challenge by reflecting on the notion of control and, in a sense, gaining back the control by reappraising reassessing, reshaping the goal that we set for ourselves by coming to appreciate that it's more complex than just doing a few mechanical steps that should lead to a certain result. Okay, so is it, have we solved the problem? Certainly not. We haven't solved any problem. We haven't solved the problem posed by the implementation challenge in the version of the uptake problem, but we did put it into perspective, and we questioned it. Why did we question it? Because we concluded that whether one has control is a gradable and, most importantly, goal relative question. And with respect to conceptual engineering implementation projects, given an appropriate articulation of the relevant goals and expectations, it is perfectly possible that implementers enjoy sufficient and therefore significant control over the speaker's use of language. Okay, so I've sort of given a template argument for addressing the implementation challenge. Now I would like to examine some current approaches, some current proposals that have been put forward to address the implementation challenge. And I would like to interpret them, to read them based on this proposal that places emphasis on the goal relativity of control. So some authors like Mark Pinder and Sigurd Joram have proposed to adopt a small scale approach to conceptual engineering to sort of gain back control. Mark Pinder, for example, says, well, but why don't we sort of start small? We start changing speaker meaning in local contexts. Who knows where this might lead us? But the enterprise of changing speaker meaning in delimited context seems to be feasible. And Sigurd Joram says something different. He simply assumes a different semantics. He says, well, given that meaning is mostly underdetermined, why don't we modulate underdetermined meaning in each local context? And why don't conceptual engineers go for this strategy to gain back control? We could read these proposals in terms of, on the one hand, raising the control threshold, and on the other hand, achieving this level of control while decreasing scale. So decreasing scale means being able to meet the high, moderately high level of control that would be required. I think there's an approach that also goes in the opposite direction. So Stefan Koch argues that communities have collective long-range control over reference change. And if I understand his proposal correctly, to have collective long-range control, all it's needed is that we know in principle which steps to take such that they would lead to a change in reference. So the possibility is enough for having control. We may read him as somehow lowering the control threshold and achieving this level of control by saying, well, we just need the possibility that this is feasible, that this can be done, while increasing scale. So while maintaining the scale quite large and on big, large communities. So this is a proposal. I'm just trying to sort of to see if there is any common pattern to these proposals that seem to come from different directions and perhaps do enjoy some common traits. Okay, so one possible observation that I think comes natural is this all a trick? So is it true that one can gain control by lowering one threshold? There are some suggestions from other debates that that this is just irrational. This is just a trick. Compare the bank case. Okay, so there's Sarah, who is driving past the bank and wonders if the bank will be open on Saturday, and her only evidence is her memory that she saw the bank being open 2 weeks before. But she really needs to know with a certain level of precision whether it will be open or not, because she has to deposit a paycheck, otherwise she will face consequences. So it seems like her evidence is not enough to constitute knowledge. Could she just lower her standards? Could she just sort of become more tolerant or laid back and say, oh yeah, well, that's enough. I've seen it 2 weeks ago, that's enough. Well, it seems irrational. It seems kind of crazy because she keeps having the high stakes, the need to sort of deposit the paycheck. So it seems irrational to just go for this gambit of lowering the threshold and gaining evidence suddenly. So is this what we're doing here as well? Is this a trick? Is this something irrational? I think it's not. I think there's an important disanalogy here. I think that in the case of conceptual engineering, one gains control while reshaping or resetting one's goal. So one brings in more elements, many of which have to do with the possibility of failure, the risks, and so on. And so that's how one gains control. It's not just that one becomes more relaxed, okay? It's some sort of global reappraisal, reshaping of one's goals that allows one to have a sufficient or the relevant degree of control. So that's what's happening in the case of conceptual engineering. I don't think this is happening in the bank example. I think in the bank example, we have the impression that this is irrational because the person keeps the goal fixed. So they keep having the goal of having to urgently deposit the paycheck. So becoming more relaxed isn't going to help them if they don't do something with their goal. So I think that's the disanalogy. I think that's why that's not a trick. It's certainly not a way of sort of solving the problem. It's a way of, as I said, putting it into perspective and questioning it and concluding that it's not as pressing if we reflect on the goal relativity of control. Okay, so I started out with the implementation challenge. I argued that we don't really need a supervenience-based formulation because, first of all, non-supervenience-based account of meaning are available. Implementation is a practical problem, so maybe we could work out a formulation of the implementation challenge that sort of cuts across these different metasemantics accounts and that sort of emphasizes the practical aspect of the implementation challenge. So I've proposed what I've called the uptake problem, which says that we lack control over the language use of other people and its causally relevant factors. And then I've tried to address the uptake problem. I think addressing the uptake problem is possible because it's sort of stripped off of these metaphysical notions that seem to render control so out of reach. If we focus just on language use and its causally relevant factors, maybe it becomes more tractable. So the way I proposed to address the problem was by reflecting on the goal relativity of control by essentially saying, well, whether or not we have control depends on how we present the goal. And I've tried to sort of see some recent accounts through this lens of lowering or increasing the level of control by modifying the scale of the project and, in a sense, the related goal. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for listening.